for today. I will introduce myself. I'm glad everyone introduced themselves in the chat. I'll lead us through a grounding. Then we'll go over some terms that will just help this conversation so we can all be on the same page when we talk about conflict. Then we'll talk about how do we understand conflict? What are the ways we can think about the many different conflicts we encounter in our lives? I'll talk a little bit about how we can prevent conflicts. And then I'll talk about how do we repair after a conflict has happened. If I don't cover something or you want to know more about something, please keep your questions, write them down. I left a good portion of time for Q&A, and I want to hear your voices in the conversation. So if you have a question, or even if you have a scenario you would like advice on, a conflict you're currently navigating, I want to hear about it. If there's something I said that really brought a powerful insight for you, I invite you to share it, because I truly believe knowledge is non-hierarchical, right? So I can know a lot about something and you can know something different, but I think we're all here today because we want to learn. And I think that desire is really powerful. As Taylor said, we are at a time where there are attacks on our community. And that is actually why I do this work. So let me go ahead and get to my intro. So my name is Opulence Abundance. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a speaker. I identify as a transformative facilitator. And I'll share more about that. I help people navigate conflict. And I also am a healer. That is actually my first training is in healing. And I feel that I am qualified to work through conflict because of my friendships. I've had very old friendships. And a big part of my story is informed by an incredible person named Mariela Saba, who's a Los Angeles-based organizer. And Mariela we were at a community event and Mariela took the mic. And Mariela said, we are in a war. We're in war on our minds and bodies and hearts. Our communities are the center of these different wars. Like there's all this war happening and we have to acknowledge it and we have to fight back. This so moved me because I realized she was right. Whether it's the ads in our Instagram story or the cops harassing us or ICE going into our communities, we are unfortunately at war. And what I realized was that we can internalize the war and we can replicate it in our mind and in our heart. And I realized that my relationships were a site of war. They were not a site of refuge, but a place where we replicated the violence of the outside world. And I realized, excuse me, I realized that I wanted to change that. And that is what motivated me to get into conflict work. Something else that qualifies me is that as a young person, as maybe 2021, I was socially canceled. So not on the internet, but in my friend group, I was disinvited from everything. And it was really heartbreaking. And so it pushed me on this journey to understand this phenomenon of being discarded by community. And it also pushed me on a journey of building new community. And in that new community, I wanted it to be resilient. So when I say I'm qualified by my friendships, I'm really speaking to this experience of what it is to have my world almost disintegrate and the heartbreak of a community heartbreak. And then to rebuild that and to be in friendships where I feel led by love and I feel the resilience. So that's a little bit about me. I am going to lead us through a grounding. We'll do this grounding together. And then after the grounding, I'll actually read us a poem. And then after the poem, I'll tell us a story. And I'm doing this because sometimes when we ground, we get a little disoriented. And I think it's nice to hear a story after. I'm just taking a moment to check in with the chat. Okay, wonderful. All right, so we'll do this today. And what we'll do is we'll follow along with the poses on the screen. And we'll take 3 breaths in each pose. And then we'll do this exercise throughout the time. So think about which pose you like, because at the end, I'll ask you to choose one that you just like, and we'll do that pose again. Okay, so the first one is hands on either side of the head. And we'll just take 3 breaths here. When you're ready, take one hand and place it on your forehead, one hand on the back of your head. And again, we'll just take 3 breaths here at your own pace. When you're ready, take that hand on the back of your head and place it over your heart. And again, when you're ready, take that hand that's on your forehead and place it on your stomach or like lower, like on the belly button or below. When you're ready, raise that hand that's on your belly. So it's on your solar plexus, above your belly button, below your chest. Take the hand on your heart and take it to the back of the head. And we'll take 3 breaths here. Take a moment to think about which pose felt the best for you today. Just take that pose and we'll take another 3 breaths. Keep breathing. And you can breathe in pose or not. If you can just let me know when, um, actually, I'm going to read this poem for us first, and then I'll have us do this. But keep breathing. You can stay in a pose. And I'm going to read this poem for us by Joy Harjo. It's called This Morning I Pray for My Enemies. My apologies for not having it on the screen. Actually, I can. Sorry, guys. I was sort of avoiding moving my PowerPoint, but okay, here we are. Okay, This Morning I Pray for My Enemies by Joy Harjo. Joy Harjo was the first United States Native Poet Laureate, and she wrote a beautiful book called Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings, which is about her experience of working as a Native person with the US government to negotiate land treaties. And her work really guides me. So this morning I pray for my enemies. And whom do I call my enemy? An enemy must be worthy of engagement. I turn in the direction of the sun and keep walking. It's the heart that asks the question, not my furious mind. The heart is the smaller cousin of the sun. It sees and knows everything. It hears the gnashing, even as it hears the blessing. The door to the mind should only open from the heart. An enemy who gets in risks the danger of becoming friend. I love that poem. Um, if that poem allowed you to feel something, and if you're just with me, you're back from the meditation, if you can just put like an emoji in the chat or just a word in the chat about how you might be feeling. I see your emoji, Taylor. Thank you. And if you feel moved to come on camera, I know this is being recorded, so that's a thing to think about, but I love seeing people's faces when I do this training. So if you're able to come on camera, I would love to see you, just to know you're with me. Ooh, I love these emojis, the alien, the heart, the cow, the feather. Oh, a hug, hope. Wow, I love this beautiful sun heart, a unicorn, a heart present, applause, rainbows, butterflies. Thank you so much, Taylor, for putting it in the chat. Oh, and I also love that it feels good to take a pause. And thank you, everyone. I love seeing your faces. Okay, this is beautiful. Okay, so I said I would give you a poem and a story. And if you get nothing else from this workshop, I think this story goes a long way. And so this story actually takes place, and this is a true story. For a long time, I thought this story was made up. And this is the story of the Golden Buddha. And I actually have recorded this story on my podcast. It's the second episode of this first season, Opulence and the Golden Buddha. And the podcast is called Earthworm Slumber Party. I recorded it because it's such an impactful story. It's very useful to share with friends. So, once upon a time, there was a monastery and they had a beautiful they had a beautiful clay Buddha. It was gigantic. They loved their clay Buddha. Visitors came from far and wide and they would show them the clay Buddha. They loved this Buddha, very old Buddha. One day, one very hot day, because this is in a kind of humid climate and it was just unusually dry, the clay of the Buddha began to crack. And the monks were all like, oh no, not our beautiful, precious Buddha. Like they can't be cracking open. And, many statues, especially Buddhist statues, are actually hollow on the inside and they have the teachings written in meditation that are inside. So the head monk got a flashlight to see how he could repair it. And he was expecting just to see how thick it was. And he shines his flashlight into the cracks of the Buddha. And what does he see but gold flashing back at him? And so then the monks went through their records and they learned that 200 years earlier, invaders had come to the valley. And to prevent their beloved Buddha from being looted, they had covered the Buddha in clay to disguise him as something less worthwhile. What so moves me about this story, and again, if this story brings up something for you, put an emoji in the chat, okay? Because it always makes me a little emotional. And one of the things I love about it is that the monks loved the Buddha when the Buddha was clay. They loved the Buddha before they knew the truth of the Buddha being cold. This story, as I said, is a true story. But it's also an allegory and it holds many lessons for us, especially when we navigate conflict. In my experience, conflict can be so overwhelming because we can become paralyzed or triggered. We can doubt our goodness, and we can also lose sight of who is in front of us, and we can doubt their goodness. So when it comes to conflict, I do encourage us to the degree, there's conflict that happens in all sorts of situations, and safety is always something to navigate. So I'm not saying to do this to necessarily disregard power dynamics or disregard your own safety or to see someone's goodness so much that you ignore or invalidate the harm they perpetrate to you. But what I am saying is if you can keep your own inner golden Buddha in mind, or keep that other person's golden Buddha in mind, despite whatever clay or conditioning we have to wear to protect ourselves, it can change the tone of the conflict dramatically. Okay, let me see y'all's emojis. I just love a good emoji. Ooh, I love that trophy, Taylor, and the swan. I consciously build storytelling into my conflict work because I'm very mindful that the people in our communities who used to resolve conflicts were our elders. And it is because we are in this moment of colonial violence that our elders are not available to help us. And so I try and draw on the tools of our elders. One of those being stories. Another one of those being the type of love I'm talking about, the love of being able to see each other. And our elders were uniquely able to do that because of their position and the true power of experience they held, right? So I'm just faking that power of experience, but the golden Buddha can help us get there. Oh, thank you. Oh, wow, Brie, I'm so moved by this heart cat tree. Oh, and the hearts and the pandas. Wow, these are beautiful. Thank you guys for sharing. It helps me to know that people are really feeling it. Okay, so now we're going to shift into some key terms. And thank you, Taylor, for putting the podcast in the chat. Really helpful. Okay, so let's just take a breath. We're going to just start by talking about what is conflict. And I'm actually so curious what y'all think. If you want to put in the chat, like, how would you define conflict? Oh, I'm glad you like the images. I think images are really important to being able to stay engaged in presentations. But yeah, what is a conflict? When two or more forces are at odds with one another. Yeah, that's a great definition. When there's a miscommunication or misalignment in needs or wants. Also, incredible definition. In both definitions, I'm hearing a difference in desire, attention, right? Okay, I'm hearing people agree. Fighting. Yeah. When we think about conflict, we often think about fighting. Disagreement, inconsistent incompatibility, misunderstanding, incongruence, avoidance of needs, wants, concerns. Okay, I love this. I love that you listed several things because it can be multiple different things, right? It can be fighting, but it could just be a disagreement. It could just be two people wanting different things. Oh, great point, Avery. Yeah, there's internal conflicts. There's moments when our feelings and thoughts aren't aligned. There are even moments when we feel two different ways, which, like, how uncomfortable, right? Would be easier sometimes if we just felt one way. Somatic dysregulation. Yeah, feeling that dis-ease. That's part of how we know we're in conflict, is when we feel those things. When two parties have two opposing needs or two different strategies that go against each other when going for the same goal. Wow, I love in that definition how it speaks to opposing needs, opposing strategy. A framework I didn't include today, but I'm very fascinated by is nonviolent communication. And in nonviolent communication, they talk about how we share needs. We all need food, water, belonging, but we may have different strategies for getting that need met. And nonviolent communication seeks to prevent conflict or resolve conflict by valuing all strategies and not creating hierarchy between them. Okay, a moral injury, misaligned system, self versus system. Very nuanced take here. Love that. And trying to avoid multiplicity or simultaneous truths. Oh, and Taylor does not think of conflict as inherently negative. It's often healthy. Okay, I love this. You guys touched on a lot of what I created, and I see there's more coming in. People agree with Taylor. When shit doesn't align, whether it's people, goals, values, needs, tensions pop off because something or someone's got to give. Could be loud and messy or quiet or passive aggressive or respectful, but either way, it's friction that demands attention. April, that reminds me of like during COVID when there was so much tension building up. I was just like, oh, yeah, something's got to give. There's like something that has to be expressed or released. And there's this way where conflict, to Taylor's point, it's a part of our lives. So here I said a lot of what you all said. It can be different ideas, misunderstanding, miscommunication, a clash, an expression of a boundary, a passionate no, disagreement. I was just guessing too, or not guessing, but just giving voice to the multiplicity. I too love friction that demands attention. That's such a beautiful turn of phrase. To share, to give voice to what you all said, conflict does exist on a spectrum, right? So it can go from being like, I want pizza for dinner, I want Chinese for dinner, to being like, we cannot talk to each other. Your love of Chinese food is offensive. And not all conflict is traumatic or painful. I work with couples, and inevitably I'll meet a couple where someone says, we're so easy, we never have conflict. And I actually think it's the opposite. I think they have conflict all the time, but there's so much trust and ability to resolve the conflict that they don't even realize they have conflict. There's so much safety to express desire, and the ability to problem solve is there, that when there's a difference, they just work through it and they don't even perceive that they've had a difference, right? But we all have conflict. We all do not think the same things all the time. And that is actually our gift. And, I took these slides out, but when I do this training for organizations, I often highlight that the research shows to an astounding level that teams that are different are more productive, more innovative, more resilient, better problem solvers. Because when we all think one way, we are limited in our capacity. We cannot imagine the same way that if we have multiple different people. So our difference is truly our gift. And I think the reason we learn to navigate conflict is so that we have the tools to tolerate difference. And we're going to go into it today. I'm going to share a lot, but ultimately that ability to tolerate difference, that is where a lot of this work lives. And what we see in this current world is that there is a righteousness and a rejection around difference. And so I just want to plant that seed, right? Let me check in with our chat. Yes, conflict can be generative and transformative. So when we talk about conflict in multiracial spaces, which I just wanted to shine a little spotlight on, sometimes the conflicts that occur are reflective of systemic conditions. And that is actually why I use the term conflict navigation and not conflict resolution. Because sometimes I think of it as like we're on a boat together. We have to navigate this storm. And maybe our captain has a broken leg, or maybe the whole crew has COVID, right? Like maybe there's something going on that's creating a lot of tension, but it's not necessarily about solving every little thing. Or because some of the tension people feel is maybe righteous, or maybe it's justified. And sometimes when we think of an individual having to answer for a system, so what I think about that is that it's so funny. My friends were like, hey, they're defunding DEI work, so call your training something different. So I said, okay, I'll do conflict work, I won't do diversity work. But every conflict I got called in on organizationally was ultimately a racial conflict. And I think that is because we are many different cultures coming together. And I think one of the tension points is that for people who may be white, it's like, oh, this person has this wound that's reflective of the past or of systemic conditions. How do I, as an individual, hold accountability or answer to that? And it's very complex. And I think on one end, I always give the compassion to say, like, an individual having to be accountable to something systemic, that's like a mismatch, right? We have to name that it's a systemic condition. But at the same time, we must also recognize that our friends of color are answering to systemic conditions constantly. And so when we can name the systemic between us, it can allow us to operate individually. And when we can give permission to the systemic to be acknowledged, when we can give permission to the ancestral energies to be acknowledged, and we don't have to solve everything, then we can really fly together. Then this boat can really get through the storm. But if we're on a boat in a storm and I need you to like, if my need has to be rigid and complex and deny some part of your reality, we may perish in the waves, I fear. I'm just looking at the chat. Cultural humility, yes. Tolerating change. And conflict can also reflect internal biases when boundaries are crossed or need to be upheld, bring up insecurities, fears, and feelings that are hard for people to address. Absolutely. I love that comment. I do think that is why conflict is healthy. Sometimes I think a conflict happens because the person who always says yes suddenly says no. And so when I go into the conflict, I'm like, there was a no, like, let's have a no party. Let's celebrate that someone finally said no. And sometimes they say that no in a very destructive way. So I think we have to celebrate the boundary and the inner fire alongside naming the harm, right? I also think that absolutely conflict reflects biases, which is why sometimes people are like, this is not a racial issue, but I just hate that person. And it's like, oh no, homie, there is something going on here, right? Like, and I think it's interesting because in speaking to organizations and culture, there are cultures that are extremely homogenous where everyone, even if everyone is not the same, a culture of norms has developed that everyone is playing the same script into. An example I'm going to give is I used to work at a cupcake shop, and we had a lot of inside jokes that we were constantly saying. So everyone knew the punchline, everyone performed this all the time. When new people came in, they were obvious outsiders. And it created a real power dynamic of if someone cared to explain the joke to them or not, right? And so in those cultures that are very homogenous and there's been a established norm, and if you go against the norm, you're weird or wrong. I've noticed that people even see people who don't maybe tell a different type of joke, they're seen as weird, strange, wrong, offensive. I've noticed in certain cultures when people are different, that is equated to harm. And I think that's a culture to pay attention to when difference is equated to harm. Um, what I find in those cultures that are highly homogenous, that have a lot of groupthink going on, that have a lot of implicit norms that people say are obvious but are actually unusual, oftentimes the people, even the people who are high in the hierarchy of that culture, feel silenced and unable to talk about important issues. Often when I go deeper into those communities, I find that there's a lot of loneliness, and even people who I would perceive to have power within the culture feel powerless in some way or even feel silenced. And there's a lot of fear that if you break out from the norm or talk about something real, that you will be discarded. I think those are some of the least healthy cultures. I think in contrast, and what I really work with organizations to think about is how do we create cultures of feedback? How do we create cultures where we feel free to share? How do we create cultures where we normalize giving and receiving feedback? And plot twist, it starts with leadership, right? So, like, if you as a leader can model receiving feedback without penalizing or retaliating against your staff, you can drastically shift a culture. Too often in these cultures, leadership is holding staff hyper accountable. So it's a punitive culture, right? And that's why the work starts with leadership. And why I personally am in the work I'm doing, I'm always like, let me do some executive coaching. You know, of course I can train your staff all day, but your staff's probably overtrained, right? It's often leadership that has to hold down the norms in our culture. But if we can create a culture where difference is celebrated and where people can say, oh my God, I never would have thought of that joke. That's so funny. Or that's not my humor, but I love how you live. You know, like if we can create some openness for difference. If we can, as an individual in those cultures, challenge our coworkers or friends with the power we do have to say, like, hey, I see that you're like putting that person down because they didn't laugh at your joke, but maybe they didn't catch the cultural reference or the language, or, if we can, as people, kind of create that kindness and open it a little, I think it can be really powerful. Okay, we did some talking, so pick a pose, any pose, and let's just take a breath. All right, let's take our breath here. Okay, thank y'all for breathing with me. I really appreciate that. Okay, I think that I already spoke to this, just navigating conflict versus resolving it. I wanted to share another story with you all, and this one's a little serious, so I'm glad we just did some breathing. This past weekend, I planned from 2 states away, actually from another coast. I live in the East Coast, and I planned a West Coast camping trip with like 15 other queer and trans people of color. I sourced camping gear, and I did it all as a practice of building community, because I truly believe that camping is important apocalypse survival, and I wanted all my friends to be closer together. Unfortunately, halfway through our camping trip, we were targeted by white supremacists and had the cops called on us and had to suddenly leave the camping trip. It was really heartbreaking, especially since the camping trip was called Pleasure Fest. And whatever happened there is far from pleasure. It's a little traumatic. And in many ways, I'm a person that has been hate crimed multiple times. I honestly, it doesn't really, it does unfortunately change my behavior because I seek to prevent being hate crimed, but it's not an unusual part of my life. I think what was unusual about this was both that it's an escalated level of targeting that is new for me, um, and that it happened to a group of us, and also that it felt like explicitly colonial violence. It was separating us from land. Um, I share this story because even as the state was pressuring us and threatening us with arrest while we attempted to pack up a campsite that we had been anticipating being in for another 2 nights. And so you can imagine the level of groceries and objects and tents, like so much, right? Um, we as a group never turned on each other. And I think that is, even as we packed up, we stayed laughing. And that was the saving grace. But it also kind of showed me, I was hoping to weave my friends together in like a beautiful intentional blanket through pleasure. And that state kind of came in and rubbed us together, and now we're really knotted up. But I think what it was so sweet in our debriefs is that people acknowledged that nobody turned on each other, nobody crashed out. But everyone said, hey, if someone had had a breakdown, freak out, crying, yelling moment, we could have handled it. And I was like, wow, we are a strong crew. We're going to survive this storm, right? And so I asked these questions. I really do. When I'm in organizations, when I work with organizations or like community groups, volunteer groups, I love community groups, especially because us choosing to volunteer our time is one of the ways we heal from extractive capitalism, when we gift our time to each other. So when I work with a volunteer group, I really ask everyone, like, hey, you're going to go on this boat together. That's what you're agreeing to do by being on this group. Do you individually have everything you need to be on the boat? And I think as my practice has evolved, I used to say, like, well, if you're at capacity, get off the boat. But now I say, we're on this boat. We didn't anticipate this storm. How can we move at the pace of our slowest member? How can we actually acknowledge that we all have needs and that we're on this boat? And especially now, we may not know each other, but all of us who value difference are on one boat together, and we need to come together to navigate this storm just for our people to survive, right? I think what was also heartbreaking is to come back from this weekend and to witness, I want to intentionally speak this name in here, but to witness the murder of Jonathan Joss and to understand that, like, the violence I face lives in relationship to this other violence we're facing. And so, with that, I'm actually going to invite us again just to take 3 breaths. No pose this time, but just taking some breaths for our current selves, a breath for the past, our ancestors, for Jonathan, and a breath for the future we're building together. Thank you all for the empathy in the chat. I really appreciate just being able to talk about it and be witnessed in it. I really go by a no secrets ideology. My framework of the boat and us navigating together actually came from Thich Nhat Hanh, one of my favorite beloved ancestors, a Vietnamese monk, who has spoken many times about the experience of being on a literal boat, a refugee boat, and how he will encounter storms or pirates. And Thich Nhat Hanh says, when the crowded Vietnamese refugee boats met with storms or pirates, if everyone panicked, all would be lost. But if even one person on the boat remained calm and centered, it was enough. It showed the way for everyone to survive. So I know conflicts can get weird, they can escalate, they can go from an incident to, like, suddenly that person has you blocked on Instagram and you're like documenting everything over email. But if one of us, if anyone in the room, on the boat, in the org can just take some breaths and hold space for everyone's humanity, can encourage breathing, can encourage the reminder that everyone is human, I think it can go a long way. These things, I'm having a couple ideas come up that I didn't put in the presentation, so I'm going to name them. A really helpful framework I use with people is just reminding us that we are all entitled to our own truth. You get to stand in what you feel happens, and you get to be validated in that. So if I'm like, Taylor came into my office and slapped me in the face with a salmon, I get to hold that story, okay? And if Taylor is like, Opulence, I came into your like office with a can of salmon and asked if you had lunch. Like, what are you saying? I get to hold my version of reality, however delusional it may be, and Taylor gets to hold their version of reality. We may be able to unpack and that's a lot of the word I do. I'm like, what happens and where do the narratives diverge? And what narrative can we agree on? Like, clearly a fish was involved. But I just say that because, like, people, I think, sometimes are fighting for their truth to be validated. And so they need the other person to be 100% wrong so they can be 100% right. Because there's a lack of confidence in the experience. But when we say, I can have my experience, and if I felt harmed, I felt harmed. Something Taylor did, whether they meant it or not, was harmful. Maybe that actually also allows me to release the hyperbole around my story. I give that playful example, but I will say I have navigated many conflicts between many different pairs, business owners, friends, roommates, lovers. What I notice is when I am with 2 white people who are in conflict with each other, they will always try and convince me that the other person is a racist. And just to be frank, I'm always like, oh, don't worry, guys. I know you're both racist. Like, nobody needs to convince me of anything. And I'm here because I see your humanity, and I don't I don't know, everyone in this situation is white. Like what's the purpose of bringing this up? And what I've learned is that I think people are sometimes trying to say, that person's bad, I'm good. See my goodness, believe me. And it definitely makes me sad because I'm like, I believe you whether you're good or bad. And I think these labels mean more to you than they mean to me and maybe even to the other person. So I just want to offer that in that when we find ourselves fighting for our truth, defending ourselves, it might be actually an invitation to go within and to validate our truth and remember that we determine our truth. No one else does. And that is something each human has a right to. We all have a right to our version of reality and our story. Okay, I'm glad I brought in some breath again. So again, just pick a pose, any pose, and we'll take our 3 breaths. And you don't have to do one actually. I just put it in here for a little something extra. Thank you all for breathing with me. I love the chat. But I agree with you, George. When conflict is presented, the first inclination is hold on to your ego identity for dear life to feel a sense of self, and it's protective. I think in this world, we're presented with a lot of opportunities to abandon the collective for our individual safety or desire. And I truly believe that as we grow and push ourselves to challenge that inclination and to remember that actually supporting the group is just as good as but it's not always true. It depends on the group, right? But there's some tension about individual versus group that we are collectively working out, right? And I think about how when we choose not to protest and instead we pay the high rent, all of our rents go up. And what we see on a global scale is like, or on a national scale, collectively, the rents are really high. I'm like, wow, we're really holding on to our individual selves right now. So just something to think about. Okay, so this is a really good framework. I'm keeping an eye on the time, so I will be trying to move a little faster. This is all so rich. But there's something I use called a hurt, harm, ouch. And this is an assessment tool I use when there's conflict. So I actually wish I think this is how it sounds best phonetically, but in terms of actually a scale, it goes ouch, hurt, harm. So an ouch is what it sounds like. It's like when someone makes a joke that might be too forward, or maybe you realize all your friends got invited to something and you didn't. Like it's just a moment where you're like, ouch, wait, that kind of hurt. Nobody crossed a boundary. There wasn't like it maybe wasn't a biggest deal, but it did kind of snag at something, or you felt it. It's like a pinch. There, multiple ouches can equate to hurt and harm. So all of these things can build towards that. Hurt is, it can either be multiple ouches or it can be something that happens that does not necessarily break a rule or cross a boundary. Maybe it does if you stretch it, but it causes significant emotional distress and loss of trust. And it is more about emotional injury than the like literally something bad happening. But it's very important to give voice to, because when I speak to all the white people trying to tell me that the other person is racist, I'm like, oh, we're not standing in our hurt, or we don't believe our hurt is enough. So then we're inventing harm, right? To try and justify the hurt. The final level of this is harm. I define harm. I use Kai Cheng Tom's definition of harm, which is a significant boundary cross. So harm is, I would say when I use the term harm, I am referring to a significant intentional boundary cross. So assault of some form, deception of some form, um, Yeah. So those live in a spectrum for me. Ouch, hurt, harm, and multiple hurts, multiple ouches can build into a hurt or a harm. This is very common. Sometimes we're like, you always forget my name. And that's actually starting to feel like racist harm, or you always misgender me. And that is starting to feel harmful. So I hope that's clarifying. Let me see if there's any. Oh, wow. I'm just going to take a moment to read the chat. And if anyone has questions about the framework, let me know. I love this comment. So someone in the chat is sharing about how when entering conflict, they've been accused of being misogynistic. And of course, we all can hold misogyny, but it's very difficult to see those words and frameworks become weaponized in response to accountability. And that's really relatable. Oh, and also thank you for joining us, Lauren. It's very relatable and also something I've experienced. Actually, sometimes when trying to bring up racist harm, people have been like, oh, you're treating me like I'm a clueless white woman. And I very often, going back to like, we all get to choose our truth. I personally also say, you get to reject whatever truth doesn't resonate with you. So a couple words I'll use sometimes is to say like, I want to understand what you're feeling, but I want to apologize from a genuine place. So at this time, I don't feel comfortable apologizing for that because it's not my truth, but I can see that I've hurt you and I'm sorry. I may also say, that's not my truth, but I see that you're feeling that. And sometimes I try and draw people in to say, like, what is a trigger? What is a projection? And what is my action? So, very relatable. People evade accountability in all sorts of ways. And unfortunately, all sorts of things can be weaponized. I'm going to skip that one. But I do want to acknowledge power dynamics in this conversation. Power dynamics, I think, are very complex, very often in conflicts. I will enter into a conflict where both people feel that the other person has significant power over them. And I feel that my role as a navigator is to actually say, who has literal power over the other person? Who's paying rent? Who has more money? Who might have race or class privilege? Who might have education? Who might have more freedom? Who might have a support network? Who might literally be a boss in this situation? A lot of times, supervisors that I work with do feel that their staff have power over them. And it's not a wrong way to feel. Our workers do have some rights, right? And I think what's so interesting about conflict is that people often feel manipulated by emotion or people struggle to say no. And so sometimes people can take on a power over position with someone who has literal power over them. And this is complex. So I want to clarify what I'm saying here. If you're uncomfortable saying no, and someone is able to understand that and just ask for things and use your yes, I don't know if that's in the most integrity. At the same time, nothing changes our literal power positions. So I want to be really clear. When I'm in these conflicts and someone's like, my staff has all this power over me, a lot of my work is to do the coaching of saying, while you may feel you have no power, you literally have power, right? And so when we analyze this situation, the way that the other person feels you have power over them, that is in alignment with reality. So I want to be clear that definitely the key is not to dismiss the analysis, but it is to understand that power is dynamic and complex. There is an aspect of power that is rigid and static, and that can be our positionalities. But that can also change. And then there is an aspect of how everyone feels. And what I have found is that when people are abandoning their power, when people do not want to be accountable to their power, that is when they blame others. I have also found, right? So there's a power with model, which says everyone is powerful. I seek to hold power with people. I seek to encourage people to use their power, to exercise their rights. And I too, I'm not threatened by another person having power. So that's like a more anarchist model, I guess. Then there's power under, which is people tell me what to do. I don't have power. I have to do what other people say. Then there's power over, which is I will tell you what to say, and that's my job, and you're being insubordinate, right? I find when people are power under, I work with a lot of power under executive directors who are like, I have to do what everyone else says. They're the same people that will micromanage. And so I just noticed that when we take on a power under framework, we also take on the power over. And when we take on power over, there's some part of us that takes on power under. And that is why I advocate for shared leadership. Every conflict, guys, I'm like, should you have a co-director? Or like, should you create a decision-making committee to make these big decisions with? Because when we hold power singularly, it's just really difficult. Okay, I'm gonna try and get through more of these, but I want to revisit the chat because you guys are having a really good conversation in there, but I'm like, I just got to go through. I want to give voice to transformative justice because it's such a buzzword in this moment, and I think people don't really know what it means. So when we think of our current justice system, it's what we would call punitive. Someone does something wrong, like I steal a salmon from a fish market to hit Taylor in the face with. And I get caught by the state, the fish owner is harmed. They call the cops on me, I get arrested. I have to pay restitution to the state. Maybe I have to pay an amount of money to the fish owner, but the state determines the punishment. The state might take the fish owner into account, but the state might also look into that fish owner's papers and deport them, right? Like the state might harm everyone. The state might do all sorts of things. So in this system, when you break a rule, you are accountable to the state. The state determines the punishment. It does take the victim into account sometimes, but sometimes it causes further harm. There was a movement, and there still is, of restorative justice, which is like, how might we restore the victim? How might we look at the situation? And this is happening a lot in schools. I believe it is a school-based movement that says like, oh, this kid is acting out in class because they're hungry. So instead of punishing them, what if we offer food, right? So this is a little more, how do we restore wholeness? Transformative justice emerged from the intimate partner violence sphere. So thinking of people who are in relationships that are harmful. And you can understand why it might emerge from here, because calling the state on someone in a violent relationship is very complex, right? It can put them in further harm. The state often like gives you a restraining order, and that makes you more vulnerable. So a group of organizers who were working in the anti-violence movement came together and created this beautiful body of knowledge. And if you're really interested in going deep into it, I recommend, I have resources at the end, but Creative Interventions has a website and a book and a workbook, and it's all available free. You can also buy it. Like a lot of resource has been created around this. But transformative justice essentially says, how do we address harm without replicating harm? How do we break a cycle of violence? And what we need to do to stop violence in our community is that the person causing harm needs to transform, the person experiencing harm needs to transform, and the community it's happening in needs to transform. This is a big deal. I know a lot of us are very survivor-centered. Protect the survivor. Survivor is good. They get whatever they want. Person caused harm, bad, cancel them. This says everyone created the dynamic. Everyone has patterns that need to change, including the community. Transformative justice is an explicitly relational model. So it is not social services. A stranger cannot come in and do transformative justice. It must be done by people in the community. You can get a facilitator, right? I volunteer my time for that. People sometimes, organizations can sometimes pay to hire someone who will assemble the community. And the way transformative justice processes often look is you assemble a community around the person who caused harm. You assemble a group of people around the person who experienced harm, usually 3 to 4 on both sides. And they create a support group. And all processes are different. This is a very emergent form, learning lessons all the time. But in my experience, the purpose has been for the person who experienced harm to come up with asks or needs for the community to help them negotiate, but ultimately for the person who experienced harm to create a narrative of harm and to share that with the support group of the person who caused harm, and ideally with the person who caused harm. And for that group of people to integrate and transform based on that information. So that's just an overview of what it actually is. I know that since 2020, a lot of people have been like, TJ, but I think what's difficult is that it's relational. It's meant to exist outside of capitalism, and you can't force anyone to be accountable, right? And so that is kind of the rub here. I do believe that when people are harmed, I do believe that we need to have boundaries with them. And a lot of my work is just in understanding intimate partner violence, violence, boundaries with people who are violent. That is separate from transformative justice. So just want to name all of that. Okay, when we talk about self-accountability, I do think I believe in self-accountability as a model of healthy relationships. I think it's so key, but it cannot be forced. You know, people have to choose to take responsibility. I cannot hold someone else. Well, I can hold someone else accountable in the way that I can be really fierce and say, like, and you know, when I think about what happened with me and my friends, when that white supremacist first came onto our campsite, I threw my body in front of that man and I said, back up, you know? So, like, there's a way where we can say, this is my space and you need to step outside of it. You crossed into my space at 4 p.m. yesterday afternoon. And we can hold on to facts. We can hold people accountable to facts. But I cannot force someone to be self-accountable for abusing someone. That's not it, right? We have to take responsibility for actions and consequences. That's what it means to be self-accountable. It is a choosing. It lives in opposition to blame instead of being like, Taylor forced me to slap him in the face with a salmon because he kept talking. It's more me saying, like, I have a problem and I don't know how to step away when I don't want to talk to someone anymore. So I just slap them in the face with fish. That's what's worked for me. And that is why harm happens. This is my theory. I think we continue to perpetuate harm sometimes because harm works. That's why the survival strategy stays. But I think true self-accountability requires a lot of self-compassion. You have to have a capacity to feel shame and guilt and to move past it. And I think self-accountability is a beautiful way to grow. Hmm. Okay, let's take a breathing break. Pick your pose, choose your fighter. We'll take our 3 breaths. Thank you all for breathing with me. Um, okay, so I'm just going to talk about some things that can give us shape to understanding conflict. And I did peek at the chat. but I'm like, okay, I'm gonna push through, and I'm glad y'all are asking questions because I can tell we're gonna have a really rich discussion. So we already talked about this a little bit. Conflict can activate, can be generative, it can be destructive. So generative is, oh, the person who never says no has finally said no. And we're all shocked and we don't love how they said no, but like we can rearrange, people can do more, right? Or someone is saying, hey, this coworker, they think they're being funny, but they're being racist to me, right? And then we can say, oh, let's get a racial justice training in here, right? Conflict can be destructive. So when people are, there's certain things we can't forgive each other for. So when you sit there and are like, wow, your partner is a rat-faced weasel and I never want to see them again. No, I can't mediate through that, guys. Like that is a relationship that's been torpedoed. And that is why I think the truth to navigating conflict is to tend to your own self-regulation. Conflicts can activate so much and we can react to them, but how do we want to respond? Right. And I think that there is a moment. I see that I watch the Real Housewives all the time. That's how I actually got trained in conflict. I stand by Andy Cohen, the devil, the white devil, is actually one of the best facilitators I've ever seen. Um, but I see those women, their jobs kind of rely on their connection to each other, and it relies on them harming each other. There is a way where they can get past certain things. So my partner's a rat-faced weasel. You're right. He has looked like a rat. So they keep it moving, right? But sometimes someone says your child is a rat-faced weasel and they will never move past that, right? So we all have thresholds. And I think I'm just generally like, guys, like, let's just work on self-regulating and not saying mean things to each other and we don't have to worry about it. But I do notice in some relationships, the arguing is helpful or the shouting at each other and insulting each other. Maybe that serves some purpose and you can move past it, but just be mindful of what you normalize. And conflict does and can create change. I think that is one of its most functional purposes. I think that when people are a little too comfortable in conflict, they don't realize that what gets ebbed away. And I want to be careful also to say, like, I'm someone where my community characterized me as being someone who loved conflict. These are very racialized terms. I love conflict because I love communication, is what I always offer. So definitely don't want to. I think anytime we're saying, oh, that person, too much conflict, it's like, oh, well, what is the environment they're in? But I think what I'm saying is when people consistently have a response of and are in a dynamic maybe where there is a lot of casual putting down. Sometimes I see how it can be cathartic and maybe generative, but I always want to give voice to like something is destroyed over time. The destruction is real. Okay, so this is the Thomas Killiman conflict model. And I will share these slides with you guys at the end. But essentially, I love this because all of these are just ways we can navigate conflict. There's not necessarily like a good or bad or right or wrong. So in one corner as less cooperative, more assertive, and we might envision competing. That's what's up here in the top left. This might be good if you're like, I don't know, trying to make a bid on a real estate thing. Only one person can buy the house. I'm not going to cooperate with you. I'm going to win, right? So that's competing. Avoiding low assertive, low cooperation. An example might be that you have a homie you have a minor conflict with, and someone just passed away, or they went through a major life crisis. That moment, we might just want to avoid talking about the thing that happened, but still show up with our support. All the way to the right, less assertive, more cooperative, is accommodating. And that might be because you're a facilitator and a participant has a lot of needs and you have the capacity, right? So it might just, instead of being like, do you really need someone massaging your feet while you attend the workshop? It might just be easier to buy the foot masseuse, if you have the budget. So, and then in the top right, we have collaboration. Collaboration, people, I've seen this chart where people say like win, lose, 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 win, win. The thing is that collaboration takes a high amount of energy. So does compromising, but collaboration maybe takes the most. So there are situations where that's ideal and appropriate, and people will say that's the win-win. But I think it ignores that we all have finite capacity. But if there's capacity, there might be moments when we like decide to collaborate on a zine together or a painting. Maybe I want to draw a fish. Taylor wants to draw a sandwich. I'm like, okay, let's draw a fish sandwich, you know? And that's like a really easy moment. That is similar to compromising. So there is a slight shift in there. There's a nuance where I guess what I said is compromising, whereas collaboration might really be like, let's paint something together and like to form the idea more totally. The compromising is having two visions and meeting in the middle. Collaborating is creating together. But I feel like this is just helpful to understand, just to understand how we respond to conflict and the different styles that might come forward in a neutral way. I love this. I love this diagram. It's by Kai Cheng Tom. Incredible diagram. This diagram in the center circle, you see our lizard brain conflict stress responses. We have fight, flight, freeze, fawn. We can see how, and when we look at this model, I think it's helpful to think about children versus adults. So when a child fights or has a tantrum, they're showing resistance. When a child runs, we say they're running away from home, right? They're escaping a situation. When there's fawning, they're appeasing us. And to freeze, when we think of a child freezing, they're enduring a situation. When we think of a parent escaping a situation, so leaving a baby at home and going to the store, that's abandonment, right? So the power, the relationship to power changes the action, but it can still be a survival-based action. I just find this model very insightful. When we're fawning in a power over position, we're manipulating people. It doesn't change that it can be a trauma response, but it can also have real harm when we're power over. Which is why I'm like, the more power we have, the more we have to meditate, guys, or do whatever restorative practices are for us. When we freeze in power over, it can look like neglect. And when we fight in power over, so when the state feels threatened and they have a fight response, that looks really different. In the situation I shared with you all camping, I did get the feedback that the white man, like 3 times my size, who I threw my body in front of and told him to step off my campsite, he did feel threatened by me. He felt unsafe. Um, and I said, good, you know, but ultimately he took that unsafety and called the state on me and my friends, right? And so even though he may have felt away, he still had that power over and it still manifested in violence. Similarly, me saying good, you know, maybe to him also form of violence. I am a baddie, thank you. Oh, okay. Can y'all see the Can some people see the diagram? Okay. Hopefully in the recording it comes through. Okay, let's take another breath, guys. I love taking breaths because I hope through this training you feel the momentum of the breaths working together and becoming more regulating. I don't think you need a diagram. You can just take 3 breaths with people and it can have really big impact. So thank you for breathing with me. I wanted to share this model that's from accountability mapping, but initially came about from Stacey K. Haynes, and it's described in her book, Politics of Trauma. But there's this idea that when someone is under accountable, when someone tends towards being like, I didn't do that, I did nothing wrong, the extreme version of that is retaliation. So an example might be like, I might accuse my employer of wage theft. And my employer might say, like, that's not true. I'm actually going to fire you for accusing me of wage theft. Um, Another example might be if a parent, I don't know, didn't pack you lunch and you're like, you didn't pack me lunch. And they're like, I'm never going to pack you lunch again, or I'm going to ground you for pointing that out. So when people retaliate, when you point out, that's a form of under accountability. We can also be overly accountable. So that can look like apologizing, over apologizing, apologizing not just for what we did, but things we had no control over. And the extreme form of that is manipulation. So an example of that is saying to your employer, hey, I didn't get paid on time. Your employer saying, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I can't believe this happened. I can't believe that we don't have, I like take like being like, I can't believe this happened. I'm so sorry. Oh my God, I'm so, so sorry. So that might just make you uncomfortable and be like, oh, it's okay. But then your employer could even go further and say, everything here is terrible. I'm not even good at being your boss. Do you feel like you should actually have my job, and actually make you so uncomfortable, suggest so much that you feel uncomfortable coming forward at all. That's not the best example, but I hope it makes sense. But just to say, like, what we aim for is that centered accountability to say, like, if I say, hey, I didn't get paid on time, for our employer to say, I didn't realize that happened, or that did happen. I'm sorry I didn't communicate with you that that was going to happen. That won't happen again. I hope, let me check the chat. I'm like, does this make sense? Misgendering is actually a really good example for this. Yeah, y'all get the vibe. Okay, I also want to share this accountability grid just to think about when we have a environment that's where there's high accountability. So if you do something wrong, there's going to be a high consequence, but there's going to be low support. That's a punitive environment. That tends towards punishment. If there's low accountability and low support, that's an environment where we ignore everything, right? I think thinking of misgendering as an example, it's like, is someone going to be punished for misgendering? Is everyone just going to ignore that there was someone being misgendered? If it's high accountability, high support, that's space for transformation. But if it's low accountability, high support, so that can look like, I know that Brenda keeps misgendering you, but she's really old and she can't change, right? That's when we see harm enabled. So I also just thought this was super helpful. Okay, I'm on time, actually. This is crazy. In preventing conflict, we already spoke to this, but I think this question, how do you give and receive feedback? I ask this to everyone I collaborate with. And I will ask, like, do you like it over email? Because sometimes you'll get this question and they're like, what do you mean? I'll be like, do you like it over email? Do you want me to take you out to lunch? Like, should we have a quarterly meeting? Do you want me to say something in the moment? Do you feel safer receiving feedback in a group or one-on-one? Like, just questions. Do you feel safer receiving feedback through a conversation? Do you want to have a text first, then set up a phone call? What do you like when I'm giving you feedback? And how do you like to give feedback? Is it hard for you to give feedback face to face? And people might have different needs. Someone might say, like, oh, I believe it's only respectful if you send a text, then we create an intentional phone call. Someone else might say, when I've been harmed, it's so uncomfortable. I just have to blurt it out when I can. And then you all have to negotiate where to meet each other, right? But ideally, the person being harmed, the person who has to give feedback, can take a little precedence in how they give it. And if we can be aware of each other's style, I hope we can have some kindness in it. Because maybe I say, oh, I just have to blurt it out when I can. And the other person might say, okay, I respect that, but can you be mindful not to give me feedback when I'm driving? Or I have to take care of an elder every Tuesday, and I'm really distracted that day because I'm coordinating their care. Is it okay if you only do that for me on Fridays? So there's ways we can negotiate the specifics. This is a little bit of a bigger concept. I used to be like, values, why do people talk about those? Those don't matter. Those are just buzzwords. But I think values do matter. What we value and what we value in workplace might be different than what we value in relationships. Our values are important. So, for instance, integrity might be an important value for us. How we practice integrity and our skill sets around it. These are important conversations to have with people we trust in long-standing relationships, because we often assume we share values and then we're shocked when something happens and we're like, how could that person do that? And it's like, well, maybe we didn't have a conversation. When I go into mediations, people are like, are you going to hold them accountable? And I'm like, accountable to what? What agreements did you all have? So these conversations with our friends and family are actually really important. Example I want to give is, we may all value integrity. I, as a trans person, might value integrity in a specific way. To me, integrity might be, I speak my truth, I'm authentic, but I steal pencils from Walmart. That does not violate my practice of integrity. I actually think that's justice, right? Um, but I don't see that in conflict with integrity. And actually, to me, being out, being open, telling people who I am, that's integrity. I might have a friend who's like, people don't need to know what they don't know about me. I'm not out to my family as gay. I don't ever want to be. People don't need to know things about me. But I don't steal anything from anywhere. And that's how I practice integrity. I scan every one of those pencils, and I will never not do that. So I'm just sharing that example to say, like, if we don't have these conversations, we can't really know. And we don't have to have these conversations with everyone, but when we start deepening, I think it's important to say, like, hey, I know you say you value embodiment, but I see you drink free, like, I see you get drunk every day and like kind of crash out and forget your actions. Like, can you tell me more about your, like, how you're practicing it? Or like, it seems like you really subconsciously value partying, and like that time, it's something you make time to do each day. Like, what need is that meeting for you, and how does it fit in with these things? So we don't want to attack each other, but important conversations. This is a really big concept and really important. When we feel harm or when we feel hurt, whatever, in our relationships, our intervention must match the harm. I feel that when we do not do this, this is when our relationships start to dissolve. Um, and so what I mean by this is that, like, if we're in a romantic relationship and you put down my ideas and it hurts my feelings, but I just never tell you and I just pretend it doesn't happen, that is not the intervention matching the harm. The intervention matching the harm would be for me to say, like, if I can't address it in the moment, which is okay, it would be to the next day say, like, hey, that really hurt my feelings. I know that substances were involved last night, and I know that it happened at night. Maybe can we take a couple days to pause and think about what happened? And maybe we can come up with a plan. Maybe we take a break from engaging in substances together, because that was really hurtful. I just can't have it happen again. It's hard for the intervention to match the harm, but when it doesn't, our relationships fall out of balance. I will say, when we think about this on a structural level, a systemic level, I learned this from Prentice Hemphill's podcast with Kazu Haga. His podcast is called, it used to be called Finding Our Way. Now it's called, I think it's called like The People Together or something, or Coming Together, Becoming Together. That's what it's called. He was talking about how we are intervening on centuries of harm. And so that intervention must also be centuries in the making. So there's something a little existential here. There's also this concept of feedback loops, which a feedback loop on the basic, it's like Taylor's like, hey, do you want some tuna salad? I say yes. Taylor gives me tuna salad, right? Taylor puts forth a stimulus, I respond. Taylor responds, I respond, right? I take the tuna salad, throw it in his face. No, I'm kidding. And so, like, what I notice happens in conflicts is person A says, hey, do you want tuna salad? Person B says yes, but with their body language, body tone is saying no, but they just say yes, right? And then person A could just give them the tuna salad and be like, wow, I had a great lunch today, and just keep it moving. And person B is over there like, person A doesn't care about me. They don't notice me. I can't believe they brought me this tuna salad, right? They can be seething. Another way this can go is person A knows that person B says something that's different than what they want. So they're constantly hyper vigilantly tracking what they really want, right? So with this model of thinking about the feedback loops, you can actually map out a lot of dynamics. So I just want to kind of leave it there, you all to think about. There's also a really big concept. Capacity is malleable and relational. I learned this when I was working with Mia Mingus, who I was very lucky to work with. Mia said this to me. It blew my mind. It was because I was like, Mia, how do you and this group of people have so much capacity? You guys are meeting all the time. My group is rarely meeting. And Mia said, oh, because giving capacity gives us more capacity. And so what that means is if you think about, let's say you have someone in your life, a friend, and you love this friend and they have, let's say they have long COVID, so they can't get to the store, but you adore them. They have the heart of an angel. They're so sweet to you. They're always cooking you food. And they say, hey, can you go pick up a few things at the store for me this week? You're like, yes, of course I can. I can happily do that for you. I usually use my auntie as an example. If you have a nice auntie who's really sweet, you're like, of course I'll help you. You're my auntie. But if you have that auntie that's always talking badly about you to your mom and is like saying mean things or judging you or posting homophobic Facebook statuses, and she hits you up and she's like, will you go to the store for me? No, you won't. Like, absolutely not. And so our relationship to each other determines our capacity and energy for each other. And that's why when organizations have a lot of unspoken conflict, people really drop out, right? Because the relationships are deteriorating. It's no longer a pleasant environment. And because of that, the capacity to meet even starts to like decline. This is a model for listening that's tied to motivational interviewing. Ors, so asking open-ended questions, affirming people. Open-ended questions are like, how are you? Not like, are you sad? Affirmations, I really try and genuinely think of what people have told me and say like, wow, Taylor, your love of fish, of salmon specifically, is admirable, right? So just try and think and connect and affirm. Reflective statements, this is a little advanced, but it's when I'm listening to someone and I can reflect back and add a little analysis. So maybe something like, oh wow, Taylor, I'm actually hearing you talk more, and I'm hearing how getting fish for the office is a way for you to share your culture. And when someone says they don't want to eat it, it actually feels personal. Did you realize that? So just like listening to people and maybe connecting dots for them, advanced skill. Okay. This is a therapy technique, anyways, but listening this way will change your life. The other great thing about this type of listening is you can say, like, I'm hearing that when I slapped you in the face with the fish, you felt rejected. Am I hearing you correctly? What that does is it gets everyone on the same page. We're trying to make sure we understand your truth correctly. It's no longer about us fighting, but we're actually working together to make sure I'm hearing you. This is one of my basic interventions for when something has really gone sideways, just pulling people back in and being able to reflect together. And then a summary, you don't have to do this, but this is part of the model, is you would just summarize. It would be like, oh, wow, today I came in really tired. You offered me fish. I threw it in your face. That was disrespectful of me. We were able to work through it though, and I can now really understand that you were just trying to share your culture with me. So a summary is just a literal summary. This is just more about self-regulation. Talked about that. Okay, I'm finishing us out, guys. I have another story for us though, and it's a really good story. because we're in our strategy for repair section. And the story always makes me laugh. And I'm like, oh, wow, these monks, they're going to need to repair. Okay, so once upon a time, there were three monks, and they went on a little boat together. They lived on an island monastery, very Moana, okay? And they went on a little journey to harvest some seaweed, but there was unexpectedly a storm, and their boat got turned around and they shipwrecked on an island they had never been to before. After the initial shock, they made a shelter for themselves and they just started going about their duties. So they started meditating and praying every day, foraging for food. They just continued with their life. The island spirit was so moved by them and their consistency and discipline and good hearts that the island spirit materialized to them and said, oh my gosh, sweet monks, I will grant you each a wish. I love your energy so. The first monk said, thank you, great island spirit. I've loved my time here. Thank you for caring for us. I miss my teacher. I would give anything to sit at the feet of my teacher again. Please, may I go home? Loud boom and crack. And the monk disappears, presumably returned to his teacher on their original island. The next monk is like, oh, great island spirit. I miss our Sangha. I miss community. Will you please take me home to my original island so I may be with my community again? And the island spirit says, very good. Crack. The monk disappears. The third monk comes up and says, I was having a great time here, and I actually don't want any of it to change. But I don't want to be here alone. So can you bring my other two friends back? And then there's a big crack, and the other two monks appear back on the island with them. I always hear that story, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that freaking third monk ruining it for us all. If that brought about emoji, let me know. Okay, if that brought out some emotion. But when I think about all those monks back on the island and how mad I would be, I'm like, they need to repair together. So this is Mia Mingus's 4 parts of accountability, which is self-reflection, apology. Mia has a longer essay on this on her blog, Leaving Evidence, which I really recommend. And on Leaving Evidence, she speaks to how when we are apologizing, we have to state the impact. We have to state what we did and the harm we caused. I have found that when we do not do that, people don't trust our apology. So when I say, hey, Taylor, I took the fish out of your hands, I slapped you across the face with it, and then I lied about it, and that really led you to not trust me, that is the conditions we need to receive apology. And then we actually have to change the behavior in order for the repair to truly happen. This is also a structure that I use frequently with groups to clear the air. I do think external facilitation helps, but anyone can do this. And it's in a book called Fumbling to Repair. I actually think it's on page 129, I think. But basically what you do is you put people in a circle, and I do it over Zoom. That's my preference because people, I think, do benefit from a little space from each other's nervous systems. And you can go, there's kind of 4 themes. You can do multiple rounds with each theme. But the first theme is everyone needs to name the hurt. Encourage people to use names to say, Taylor brought me fish, but not to say, Taylor brought me fish because they have bad taste. Don't insult people. Speak to what happened, be specific, but don't make character judgments, right? Like, don't be mean, but be specific, clean out the wound. Normally when I do this in a group, nobody really says what they think until one person says what they think. And then everyone else goes a second time and says what they think. Second round, and you take a 10-minute break between each, do a lot of somatics. The second round, self-accountability round. So I don't get to say, I regret that people are always bringing me fish and talking a lot, and I have to shut them up. Okay, that's not appropriate. You have to take accountability for your actions. So you have to say, I really regret that I did not use my words and that I've been leading with actions, right? So you need to give voice to what you have done to contribute to the situation. Third round, you affirm each other. So just literally the candy round after the first two ones are hard. But something magic happens in those first two rounds. I think what's magic about it is nobody responds to each other's harm directly. Everyone just shares their own harm and everyone takes accountability. And normally that is really healing. The fourth round is supposed to be next steps, but I often encourage people to pause and to do that separately. These are just questions that when we go through repair, like how do we build trust? And often conflict is a way to build trust. Small acts of kindness, remembering people's birthdays, remembering their mom's birthdays, knowing their kids' names, all those things help us know each other. Trust builds over time if it's healthy, which is why if someone doesn't trust us, that's actually good, right? It's easy to assume trust, but it's harder to rebuild, and change behavior is huge. Similarly, when we think about repair, I don't think it's always directly talking about everything for a one for one or everyone agreeing or everyone seeing your side perfectly, although that helps. And I think for big harms, that's essential. But when it's small ouches, those can happen because we're different. I actually have a friend who we just are always stepping on each other's feelings because we don't understand each other and our norms are so different. But being able to slowly over time understand what each other needs, guessing, doing our best, and also not taking it personally, giving each other grace, that's all great. But also cooking together, sharing space, low stakes play. So, and I said low stakes, so not a game of Uno, because for some people that's very high stakes, but whatever low stakes play looks like for you and your people. Okay, I have a thing. So these are some of the resources I mentioned. And as I said, I have a slide and let me actually get in that chat. Okay, in the chat, I'm dropping my a link to my survey, which has, if you use the code conflict, it'll give you a link to my slides and you can have them forever. And I'm also dropping a link to my newsletter. And while you guys take the survey, which please take, it really helps me. I'm going to catch up on the chat. Thank you for just being a great host, Taylor, and helping to source all my references.
No problem.
Oh, I love that Shira did a session with you all. Shira actually has something called the Interrupting Criminalization Help Desk, where if you have a conflict or like a TJ related problem or a problem related to Palestine organizing, you can get a free hour of coaching with Shira. So useful. Yeah, heating up fish in a microwave is a form of violence. Yay. Yes, I agree that it is unfortunate how sometimes when there is conflict, the people who caused harm can really center themselves. And I think what's happening in that moment is people who have caused harm and have more power or privilege are feeling a predatory form of guilt. And I think that's why having a facilitator can sometimes be good to push back and absorb, but to also bring power analysis in. And to try, it's very hard, but to try and say, like, in our repair, can we prevent the same dynamics replicating? What would that look like? But it's very hard. Seeing there's a really good conversation happening. about accountability avoidance based on the virtue of identity and being ontologically incapable of harm. There's a tension between realities of dehumanization through historical and ongoing systemic oppression, and also holding that people can co-opt liberatory frameworks for their own gain and or collude with their oppressors. This is such a powerful statement. I love that you started it, Ray. I don't know if Ray's still here, with not quite sure how to articulate this, and then goes into like one of the most elegant Zoom comments I've ever seen in my life. I just need to reread part of it, which is sometimes people avoid accountability by claiming that by virtue of their identity, that they are ontologically incapable of harm. There's tension there between the realities of dehumanization through historical and ongoing systemic oppression, and also holding that people can co-opt liberatory frameworks for their own gain and or collude with their oppressors. Absolutely. Absolutely. And people can co-opt liberatory frameworks, therapeutic language. Any tool can be a weapon, right? And so I think that is also why we have to be mindful. Like our movements, our spaces need to be multi-generational. We need to have ways to call each other in. We cannot hold power singularly. I definitely see groups of people, and I think a skill we also need to work on is how do you keep your homies accountable? How do you actually call in your homies and not just take everything they say as right and true and that they're the only one being harmed? And how might we reckon with our feelings of protectiveness over each other with our responsibility to hold each other accountable? You know, whenever I mediate, people often want me to be right. And I think it helps that I have a multiple oppressed identity while also being non-Black and pretty palatable. Um, but it just is what it is. Okay. I see that there's more stuff happening in the chat, and I really want to open up to hear other people's voices. I felt a relief when I heard your voice, Taylor. I don't know if there's comments or questions. There might be a question I missed back there.
I think you covered most of them. A lot of them were about specific resources, which again, I'll say if anybody didn't hear, but I'm capturing everything in the chat and we'll provide them via email at the end of next week, along with the recording, because it just takes a little while to edit and upload it to YouTube and all of that. Yeah, but if folks have specific comments, questions, anything else, feel free to come off mute, put it in the chat. But yeah, just want to thank you, Opulence, for just such an engaging session through storytelling, through examples. I really love the pacing of it and just the way that you present information.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
How can we move forward in navigating conflict if one party is unable or unwilling to engage in self-accountability at the time? Are there specific strategies, phrases you've used in the past? Yeah, this is a great question. The unwillingness to engage, in my experience, is a tactic of its own. And I encourage being mindful of the power dynamic it creates to have someone who is not available. I've seen that control the process in certain ways or control the conversation. I do believe that we are all allowed to take space and step out. I do find that clarifying capacity and motivation in the beginning is helpful. If one party is seeking conversation, I think with the other party, if there's a mediator or common friend, there are different things to weigh, including like, might the person seeking conversation escalate into the court system or into other behaviors to get your attention? In what ways can having conversation, diffuse emotion, and allow all parties to move forward. Some of the situations it's very tricky, right? Because I don't necessarily want anyone to feel coerced, and I don't. It's just very hard when both people are in their emotions, so it's difficult. Um, I think that the biggest strategy I have is restricting access if someone is unwilling to be accountable. If you cannot talk to me about the harm you caused, then unfortunately you can't be on the boat with me at this time. Um, and so I don't know if that truly addresses the situation, but that would be my answer to that question. Oh, thank you all for stroking my ego. I love it. It doesn't seem like we have any other questions at this time. So I will pass to you, Taylor. Thank you everyone for listening. I really appreciate you guys. This is one of the biggest trainings I've ever done. So just thank you all for being here and listening.
Yeah, clap it up for Opulence. Also, okay, come through largest training you've done. I'm so glad. Because I see a lot of people who have been with us before, and I think many folks know that the whole point of doing this series is to get people that are truly passionate about a lot of topics that are adjacent to harm reduction, right? Like some people might think, well, why the heck are you doing a conflict, navigation training? But I think the people here in this room understand how just kind of urgent this is in our work and how conflict is inevitable. And so many times, you know, Jesse and I, who's on the call, we go to harm reduction programs, and so many times we're there to solve an issue, right? But there's no intentional work being done about addressing that conflict. And they think having someone come in and do one training is going to solve everything, right? Which is not the point, and why we have so much turnover, why we have so much burnout. So I just really appreciate you, Opulence, for creating such a mindful session too. I really love, again, the pacing, inviting us to check in and slow down. I know, like, as someone myself who has ADHD and is constantly like multitasking, I felt very locked in. So I just appreciate that enormously. And I know we'll have you back for sure. So this is our last session. Here's the info to fill out the feedback form, which we do really appreciate. We do look at them. That's why we've introduced Spanish interpretation this year, because of you all and trying to make it more accessible. So we're trying to use our funds in a way to promote more of that language justice. Also, we have the certificate request form for you as well. Again, all this will be included in the email that we'll send out next week with the recording. But again, I just want to thank everybody. If you've been with us for all 5 sessions, I would love to know if any of you are here, if you've been to 4, 3, even if this is your second or first one, I would love to know in the chat as well, just to see who's kind of been hanging with us. But if you would like to view any of the prior sessions from the series, most of them are available on our YouTube channel, which you can find here. And these are all of our beautiful, wonderful facilitators. So shout out to Kim, Jose, to Zay, Opulence, of course, Dana, Justice Rivera, and Yona Tangi, who are just amazing. And we're very, very excited to plan for the next one. But I just want to thank everybody so much. And if you have any questions, you want to get in contact with us, Opulence, I don't know if you want to drop your email, but I'll put our email if you want to contact Lighthouse. If you want to join a monthly Lighthouse Learning Collective meeting, reach out to us. But thank you so, so much. And we hope to see you again for the next one.